the neighbor who sees everything. When I moved into my new apartment, something felt off. I was pleased to finally be done with the relocation. Everything seemed new, clean, like a chance for a fresh start. But I couldn't shake the feeling of a strange silence filling the space. Every sound, even the smallest, felt too loud. I'll get used to it, I thought, but I couldn't rid myself of the feeling that something was missing. The next day, I decided to explore the neighborhood. It was quiet. Almost too quiet. There was a heavy silence, something I wasn't used to experiencing in big cities. The windows of the buildings across from me were shut, and the streetlights cast a pale glow over the paths. Everything seemed too normal, but something about the atmosphere felt wrong, too peaceful. After walking around the area, I met my neighbor, a middle-aged man who seemed nervous. His gaze was evasive, though he smiled politely. We greeted each other and exchanged a few trivial pleasantries, as with any new acquaintance. Still, something about him made me pause. He was overly polite, yet also distant. Maybe I'm imagining things. Maybe it's just the new place unsettling me. After a while, I started noticing that my neighbor was often in the hallway whenever I was leaving or returning. It felt like he was looking for an excuse to watch me. Maybe it's just in my head, I thought, but I felt as if he were observing me. After all, who would be interested in me, right? He's just an ordinary neighbor. Or is he? That evening when I came home, I heard something. It's strange, but I'm starting to remember these moments more vividly. I heard something, like a faint movement behind my wall. Footsteps, perhaps? Maybe it was just someone in the neighboring apartment. I'm imagining things, I told myself. But I couldn't escape that feeling. It'll get better if I just ignore it. Over time, I began to feel something strange. The sounds grew louder. They were no longer just random footsteps. I started hearing things I couldn't explain. Footsteps in the night, creaks, as if something heavy were being moved. Sometimes, I'd hear something moving within the walls, something that shouldn't be there. Each time I told myself it was only in my mind, but with each passing night, the feeling intensified. I noticed him again. The neighbor, always somewhere there, in the dark corner of the window. I'd see him watching me from his apartment whenever I went outside. It couldn't be a coincidence. He was there, everywhere, and his gaze wasn't friendly. Could this be true, I wondered, or just my imagination? Then, one day when I came home, I found something. A small, almost unnoticeable recording camera placed right above my front door. I panicked. My heart started pounding, and my hands trembled. I quickly turned it off and took it inside. I didn't want to think about the implications. What could this mean? Whose recordings had been made here? I didn't want to think anymore. After that, I began to notice that my neighbor knew far too much about me. He would talk about my personal life, about things I hadn't shared with anyone, least of all him. Every time I encountered him, it was clear he knew more than I'd ever told him. This scared me. It couldn't be possible. He couldn't know these things, but the fact that he did made it all the more terrifying. I couldn't go on like this and needed to do something urgently. Things were starting to get too strange. I decided to seek professionals to check if anything was amiss in my apartment, or if someone had broken in without my permission. Things couldn't continue like this. Someone was watching me. I was certain of it now, and I had to find out who and why. When the investigation began, I learned something strange. My neighbor had debts and mental health issues. He was isolated and unstable. I'd known something was off, but now everything started to make sense. He was on edge, and I was his next target. To me, he'd just been an odd neighbor, but now I realized this was more than just oddness. It was something far more sinister. After the investigation, everything seemed to have calmed down, and I thought I'd managed to scare him off with my actions. I thought he'd given up on his obsession with me, but I was wrong. After some time, I started to find strange traces in my apartment. I'd find items that weren't mine. Objects had moved without my touching them. My personal belongings were missing. I was on the edge of madness, no longer able to pretend everything was fine. Something was happening. Something I couldn't control. One day, when I returned to my apartment after an evening walk, I noticed something. My neighbor was standing in the dark at the far end of the corridor, watching me. When he noticed me, he tried to hide, but it was too late. I'd seen him. He was following me. And I knew this wasn't a coincidence. He didn't just want to watch me. He wanted something more. After I came back inside, I discovered a hidden camera in my apartment. There was a recording on it, and after some hesitation, I decided to watch it. It was clear my neighbor had been watching and recording my every move for hours, days and nights. I was shocked. I couldn't believe my eyes. This wasn't accidental. It was clear he was planning something, and I was at the center of his plan. But what? Panic surged within me. I tried to escape the apartment and call the police, but he was already one step ahead. He cut the electricity in my apartment and locked my front door. There was no way out. I was trapped. My neighbor had locked me in, and I didn't know how to get out, or if I would survive. I could hear his footsteps approaching. He was right behind the door, quiet but persistent. I heard him press his head against the wood, as if trying to hear my every breath. My heart pounded wildly, and my hands trembled. I was trapped. There was no way to escape, no way out. Then he started talking through the door, his words cold and eerie.
You didn't understand, did you? This is all part of my plan for you.
1,000 thoughts ran through my mind. What should I do? How do you escape from something that's cornered you without even realizing it? I tried to remain silent, not to make a sound, but every move made me feel more vulnerable. My hands began to sweat, and my breathing grew heavy, as if the walls were swallowing the air around me. After a few moments of silence, I heard a creak. The door began to open. Slowly, mercilessly. I saw his shadow standing before me, cloaked in darkness, almost unrecognizable. He said nothing, just entered and stood beside me. We stood there in complete silence, as if time had stopped. And then I heard it, a thin, almost incoherent whisper.
You're part of the game.
There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I wanted to believe this was just a nightmare, that I'd wake up and everything would be normal. But it wasn't. This was reality, darkness in which I was trapped. And he was here, with me. I could only hear his footsteps and his breathing, and everything grew more ominous.
You can't escape,
he said.
This is your fate.
He moved toward me, step by step, as if each of his steps tested my patience. I saw his face in the dark, pale and smiling, but with something strange in his eyes. A vacant look, as if he were gazing through me. As he came closer, it felt like something within me awakened. Summoning all my courage, I ran with all my might toward the window, seeing it as my only escape from this nightmare. I managed to open it and climb down the fire escape to the street. I looked up and saw my neighbor leaning out, watching me with his eerie, vacant gaze from my own apartment. I ran to a nearby store where I asked for help to contact the police. The police arrived quickly, and I mustered the strength to tell them everything I knew, sharing even the smallest details of my neighbor's strange behavior. In his apartment, they found numerous recordings and evidence of his spying, including old journals and photos he had kept from previous tenants of my apartment. I watched as one piece of evidence after another emerged, revealing his dark past. It turned out he had done the same to previous tenants, obsessed with the need to control others. His isolation and obsession had only made him more dangerous. After they detained him, the police told me he had been under surveillance for a long time. I was left with the thought of what he might have done to me if I hadn't uncovered the truth in time. My neighbor was arrested, and I returned to my apartment, trying to recover from the shock. But the feeling that it could have ended far worse still hung heavily over me. Even after his arrest, my fear didn't disappear. Something in my apartment still reminded me of what had happened. Every sound and every shadow seemed suspicious. One day, I found another hidden device, small, almost unnoticeable, that must have been left from his intrusions. I realized that even now, I wasn't completely free from him. In the end, I decided the only way to fully free myself was to leave the apartment and start a new life elsewhere. But the doubt that my neighbor wasn't the only threat haunted me. In my new neighborhood, I noticed something disturbing. People were watching me, or at least it seemed that way. Paranoia had overtaken me. Could it be that everything was starting all over again? I stood frozen at the door of my new apartment, feeling my past creeping back. Would I ever be free of the fear, or had I just carried it with me to a new place? Thanks for watching. Subscribe to find out what will be the next story.